Hello, friends, and welcome back to Healing the Divide. I'm your host, Scott Feinberg, and today I am joined by Jessica Baum, who is a licensed mental health counselor and the author of Anxiously Attached, Becoming More Secure in Life and Love, and founder of BeSelfful.com, supporting individuals and couples to form healthy, long-term relationships with virtual coaching and transformational courses worldwide. As a couples and family therapist for over a decade, Jessica utilizes her unique approach to healing, the Selfful method, with a foundation in interpersonal neurobiology. It has helped thousands of clients to heal from trauma. Born and raised in Manhattan, she now lives in West Palm Beach, Florida, working with clients internationally. And I will drop a sweet little gesture into the show notes where you can link up with Jessica, learn more about her book, and redeem a free course, which is such a sweet offer. So, Jessica, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. As I just mentioned to you a moment before we started to record, I'm really looking forward to this discussion and really taking your work, which I've been able to access through these bits and pieces, primarily through Instagram, and do a little deeper dive and share more with our listeners and our viewers. And in specificity, um, I really want to get into the idea of why we are the way we are as human beings, like really pull back the veil and gain an understanding of the human journey and how our relational dynamics evolve, what lives inside of our subconscious and unconscious programming, how we can bring that up into the light of our awareness and reclaim our own narratives about what a healthy life actually looks like. That's one big category. And then I really wanted to zoom in a little bit on this idea of what is our relationship to relationship, these sort of hidden perspectives that we might superimpose onto a relationship that our partners may have a completely different frame around. And again, bringing that out into the open as well. And then in the sort of center of the episode, I've created these, I guess we can call them matches in service of relationship, of looking at various attachment styles in relationship with other styles. And perhaps I did it wrong. You're the subject matter expert, but I was able to discern about six different, matchings, if you will, like anxious to avoidant, anxious to fearful, as you call it, and then looking at the different structures of that. And what it would look like then, avoidant to avoidant, avoidant to fearful, or fearful to fearful, and see all the different expressions of these relationships that our listeners might find themselves in, and glean a deeper understanding of what are the patterns to be on the lookout for that might be challenging for us. What are the interventions that you, as a psychotherapist and coach and mental health counselor, have found most helpful? And what does the replacement pattern, what does the healthy expression look like in these different pairings? And then I have a few other sort of out of left field questions that are just fascinating to me that I wanted to check in with you on. So, that all said, first place I really wanted to start was I was taken back by the name Selfful, because as a yoga teacher for 20 some odd years now, and studying the old ancient texts, they often refer to this idea of selflessness and to like kind of counteract selfishness. And I always find myself counteracting that idea with the word selfful, which in my Bhagavad Gita behind me, you'll see lines crossed out where it says selfless, and writing in selfful. So I love that that's the name of your offering. And it looks like maybe a business around it as well. So I wanted to get your sense on what that word means and then let that be our jump off point.
Sure. Yeah. No, I appreciate that question. And when I wrote my book, a lot of people struggling with quote unquote anxious attachment or codependency become selfless to adapt and survive. So they give up their needs and kind of become programmed to the needs of others in order to stay in connection and attachment. And so using the word like be more selfish didn't resonate with my clients at one point. So I had to come up with another way to approach them. And the truth is, there's a lot of science behind. I equate selfless and selfish as adaptive strategies that are born more of fear. So, when we're super selfish, we're in a fearful place and a self-serving place that we're not in connection, and we're not, we're not in a great place when we're that selfish. And we're also not in a really great place when we're selfless and we just keep giving and giving and giving. And the context in which I use those words is more of like, where are we giving from? Is it being born of sympathetic activation or some kind of survival or adaptive strategy to stay in connection or to preserve yourself? So self-full is really the ventral state that I'm referring to, where it's a state that we all access. We're moving in and out of these states all day long, and combinations of these states. But self-full is when I can take care of my needs and I can also be there for you. And there's some flexibility and a sense of I can be who I am and you can be who you are. And that there's just a way in which we can operate as a pair where I can still feel intact and whole and complete and say no and say yes, but there's a fluid way of showing up for other people that's more in alignment for what's right for me. Not that we don't compromise for our partners or our loved ones, but we're not giving from a place of fear, and we're not becoming so self-focused from a place of fear that there's a sense of we-ness in a self-full state that, we can really take care of ourselves and each other at the same time, that interdependency can happen.
Well, that's such a beautiful way of explaining it. My less articulate double negative way would sound something like, it's not all about you, but it's not about you. And learning this through the lens of where I've studied it in the realm of yoga philosophy is so much about where the locus of identity resides. Does it exist in a fundamental notion of being not just a distinct individual, but a divided one, separated off from the tapestry of the whole, and how that consciousness produces a perception of lack, a misperception really of lack, and then how that um, you know perpetuates or promulgates in all of these different spaces of life. And then we see sort of as somebody comes into these deeper recognitions of I'm part of everything, they tend to then go all the way to the other extreme, negate themselves, discount themselves, and just sort of homogenize this identity with the whole. And now it's all about being selfless, and if you receive anything, it's like stained by the ego and all of this. And it's like, no, right back into the middle says like, I am a unique aspect of this interdependent tapestry called life, and
Mm-hmm.
to care for my individual needs while caring for the needs of the whole or the partnership, what I often call the third space. And in my relationship, we think of it as like, she has her needs, I have my needs, and then the relationship is really like its own entity that has its own needs that we both get to be stewards of and be in that dance together. And that the recognition that when we hear our partner advocate for their needs, it's something that we feel called up and inspired to support, in recognition that that's in service to the whole and it's not selfish. Really neat to come to the same
Absolutely.
awarenesses through different lenses.
When we are in womb, then we are in the earliest stages of our development. Um, we are sensing beings who are taking in our environment through sensational experiences. And we are, as humans, we are not developed when we come out of womb. We are still developing. We're still developing our nervous system. We're still developing our heart, the quality of our organs. We don't come out. We don't come out with a parasympathetic nervous system. We only come out
Mm.
with a sympathetic nervous system. So when we're in womb and early stages of development, we are very absorbent of our environment and our closest relationships. And so the quality of our relationships and connection determine the quality of our life and the very paradigm in which we somatically feel as we move about our life when we get older. So I have a sense of safety that my needs are going to get met and the world is a relatively safe place, is inside our body, and a sense of security if we had that from our primary caregivers. So we kind of embed what wiring, right brain to right brain, what is going on for them.
Mm.
So the quality of our connection, and I would say, and I'm writing about this now, it's not love that we need. Many parents love their kids. It's emotional presence and attunement that gives a baby the felt sense that, wow, I can depend on my caregiver. My needs are being met. They see into me. They're curious about me. I am separate from them, not an extension of them. What is happening a lot is that what we call intergenerational trauma, or how things are getting passed down through nervous system to nervous system, is that many parents are surviving in the world, living more in their left hemisphere. Our culture has moved more to the left. So they're not relating to the baby quite in the same way. And so the baby can learn different ways of adapting and getting their needs met. And so that's how you come up with the attachment patterns, and which pattern you can come into is how does that baby adapt to the primary caregiver to stay in connection?
Mm.
Or what does that baby learn about connection through the early interactions and co-regulation from the primary caregiver? So if your parent was struggling with, a relationship that was turbulent, or financial issues, or developmental trauma, or they didn't really do their own work, their nervous system is kind of moving through different states, not always a selfful state, but survival states. And the baby is sensing that. And not only are we sensing that, we're storing those states within, we're remembering that, and it kind of develops our sense of connection and quality of connection later on in life. So those early formative years are literally shaping our original paradigm, and play into every aspect of our life subconsciously as well. And I think that I'm going on a tangent, but I think that's what you were asking me, is like, how does this developmental? So we're not fully formed. We actually are sharing our nervous system with our primary caregiver, probably our mom. Depending on where she's at, we're one energetic unit. We're actually not individuated until like 13, right? So we're sharing the system, and depending on the quality of our home environment and the sense of ease and safety within our primary caregiver, that gets transferred to us as an infant. And none of that is done through explicit. It's all implicit information that's being kind of passed down and kind of programmed into the baby. So the hope is that your parent has a sense of safety and can attune and see into you, because that kind of sets up a good foundation for a sense of security in life.
That is absolutely wild. I just want to take a moment for everyone who needs to take a moment when they're listening to really take a breath and receive that so much of what we find ourselves struggling with in our relationships is embedded when we're in the womb, that we're sharing a nervous system, most likely with our mom, like literally imprinting somebody else's nervous system, which we know is a byproduct of the nervous system they attuned with, and everything that happened in their parents' lives that led to that, and even present in that moment of time for them, which is, we know the hormones are changing. It's like going into turbulent seas, where the primary caregiver is often in a sympathetic response, and we're attuning to that with only a sympathetic response. And that is so fascinating that by the time we are able to come out and have intellectual self-reflection, to have introspection, to really connect with a sense of identity, uh, personality is formed. This is sort of in the substrate, and it's I think an understanding of this, like to me, the takeaway of what I received and what you just shared is to have empathy and compassion for one another when we see patterns and we're like, come on, that makes no sense. Or why would you say that? Or who does that? All these things as humans where we're reactive and combustive to one another's behaviors instead of taking a breath, maybe extending a little bit of curiosity and grace and compassion and say, wow, if I'm recognizing something that feels a little off, this might be an incredible opportunity for them healing an old pattern that's wired into their nervous system. It's like, that's just incredible. And for those of us that might be moving through journeys of like either being like pregnant, with a spouse who's pregnant or a partner who's pregnant, like to really take into consideration the implication of what you just shared, that we can really change generational trauma by the way we move through our pregnancies and change the way babies are coming in. And that's just really, really cool. Um, I also took away from what you shared, and I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about this if you're open to it. That it seems like what I heard in that the need for human connection is wired into us as beings. And so often, especially in the healing work that people do, I often hear them say, I need to be by myself before I can be with anyone else. And it's like, I understand the context, but it feels to me that like when we start to separate ourselves off and isolate, that we're antithetical to the aspect of our nature that requires the healing of those relational bonds, and connection with our fellow beings. And what's your perspective on the need for connection?
I mean, I can't say this enough. My mentor, Bonnie Badenoch, says it. We quote him all the time. He's a genius, but Dr. Stephen Porges,
Hmm.
connection is a biological imperative. And that statement, I used to hear it over and over and over again. And I've been studying interpersonal biology for so long. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. Connection is but I've actually felt it. And it's like, so we are designed to be in relationship. We need connection. We need attachment. We absolutely need it. And so we will go at great lengths to kind of keep it, even in abusive situations and things like that. Always makes sense. And yet our culture is moving towards and rewards self-sufficiency, independence, and all the things that actually don't foster what we're biologically wired and how we thrive in community and how we thrive in connection. So we have these like opposing kind of forces working against what we biologically need, and how we're wired is to be in connection, and connection is what heals us, and we very much need more community and connection on this planet. And unfortunately, when you opened up our podcast and said, how did we get here, I could go into a whole thing about that. But a lot of people move out of connection as a sense of safety or protection, but um, it's not really getting that what we humanly need, which is that connection and that vulnerability and sense of belonging. That's what we crave as humans.
I feel like that just is like, um, a balm to the soul. It's just like we're always wrestling with that. How much to come out and into connection, how much to withdraw, and having different attachment styles in relationship with each other, and sort of misperceiving the pullback as abandonment, or the clamoring for connection as enmeshment, and the push pull dynamics that exist in these spaces, and learning how to genuinely regulate ourselves. And I think it becomes fascinating. I would love to hear your perspectives on something like internal family systems, parts work, doing this piece of connections with the parts of me, like inner child work, or inner adult too. I don't think all inner work is inner child work, but obviously a lot of it is. But for somebody that is engaged in that sort of inner work of communicating with aspects of their own self that have felt exiled off, how to create safe and secure attachment bonds within their own constitution.
Yeah. Well, you know, a lot of us that are taking the journey to do inner work, and I can speak for myself, and I don't know if this answers your question, but healing attachment wounds for me that were pre-verbal um, require another person.
Hmm.
And so we can't heal the attachment wound without re-experiencing healthy attachment around the original wound. So we need another person's nervous system to hold space for the wounding that might appear if it's very young. I don't know if this is answered. So to connect with my infant parts or my early wounding, which those types of wounds are so sensational because that's how we're storing memory in our body at that time. So to heal those earlier attachment wounds, we really need an attachment figure to re-experience the wound, witness, hold, and move the trauma from the body to the brain into integration. So I think
Mm.
a lot of people get stuck or struggle healing attachment because you can't heal attachment issues alone. You actually need to
Mm.
form healthy attachments with people, and that can be foreign for many people and scary because when you form real attachment to someone who's really present, you have to be more vulnerable and more of your work will show up. So I don't even remember where you asked the questions, but so forming a connection to these parts of yourself, and when activated or these parts are showing up, having a relationship to them, to start to see them as memory and start to honor every sensation in your body, and also to bring them to people who are worthy of holding them as well, is equally as important as you start to cultivate a new relationship to self and what is surfacing. Did that answer your question?
1,000%, especially this last piece, which, as I've seen in my own work, that like as we are learning, we struggle so much with doubt and not trusting ourselves. And I'm just going to broad brushstroke it for a moment as a human family. And especially when the secure bonds aren't formed, it seems. So my question around how we can integrate a deeper connection, a deeper security with our own self and those parts that feel exiled. What I took from what you shared is the part of me that advocates for, I'll say, when big me advocates for little me by calling in trustworthy relationships where it is safe to be vulnerable, because the need requires another being there to co-regulate a nervous system with. That is how I find safety between me and me, is by the willingness to call in trustworthy relationships. So they're not even really oppositional opposites, me, just me, or me and you. It's me and you by way of the me that is really navigating the experience. And so I I guess I'm curious about how the different attachment styles form, and then starting to explore what it looks like when we put them into relationship with each other. Does that feel like an accessible route for us to go, for you to look at each one a little bit more under a microscope?
Yes. Yeah. So I am writing and working on attachment, and I can talk about how each one is formed, and we don't embed just one pattern inside of us.
Wonderful.
So when we're talking about attachment, we need to understand that it's a combination of two people's embedded patterns and the relational dance that those two people take up, and that I could show up with an avoidant pattern with you and an anxious pattern with a girlfriend, that we embed many patterns. And I like to think of it as the wheel of attachment. But to make this a little bit more tangible, well, like I said, a secure baby has a parent that is attuned roughly around 66% of the time or a little bit more, that there's rupture and repair, and that baby has an inherent sense that my needs are going to get met. Even when there's a rupture or I'm upset, my mom is going to, or my primary caregiver is going to be attuned enough to kind of figure it out, and my system will settle, and I start to trust in that dance, right? Anxious, an anxious ambivalent type of attachment style, which is the one I wrote the book for.
Mhm.
These happen in babies that more or less sense that their primary caregiver is inconsistent. And sometimes the inconsistency is due to their nervous system being pulled out of ventral, and they're preoccupied maybe with work or with stress or with like they're just not consistently there. So the baby learns mom's there sometimes and not always, right? And so the shoe could drop. And I think the hallmark for ambivalent or anxious attachment is inconsistency, not a trusting in the consistency of the attachment. That baby also learns I'm going to drop my needs and actually modulate my primary caregiver. I become what they need in order to stay in connection, right? And they build a lot of empathy and a lot of sensitivity to the room, because they learn if I can be what my parent needs, then I can stay in connection. And so there's a little bit of self abandonment there. They can even regulate their parent. So
Mm.
it becomes like a role reversal in that way. Avoidant attachment, a true avoidant attachment, is when a parent is more left hemisphere shifted. So they're not attuning to the baby's needs per se. Well, they are. They're attuning to the physical needs and the tasks at hand, but they're not emotionally present because no one was emotionally present for them. So they're not emotionally present for the baby, and the baby learns, what's the point? I'm going to reach out and my mom might not respond at all, or they're not really there, and there's a lot less connection. And so, but those parents often very much love their children, but they focus more on achievement and, showing up for the child, but they're not emotionally connected. So an avoidant person either learns that conflict is not okay, or that I'm not going to get my needs met. So why even bother? I'm just going to detach from my own emotional needs altogether. And they never got the mirroring or the safety or the vulnerability to have those emotional experiences. And then later on, the fourth category that was discovered was disorganized. And disorganized pattern, which I'm familiar with, I have a pocket of disorganization inside of me, or I've experienced, is sometimes when there's abuse or severe neglect or a sense of fear with a primary caregiver. So I need the connection, and at the same time I'm terrified of the connection, right? And so I can't move forward because there's no one there, and when I move back I'm completely abandoned and isolated. So I'm stuck in this very disorganized state of terror. And so some of us have pockets of these. Luckily mine is not something I live with on a daily basis, but pair me up with someone with a very extreme attachment style, like a very avoidant person, my disorganized parts might surface. So I think it's good to know that I had a little bit of anxious ambivalent with my mom, a little bit of avoidance with my dad, some security with my grandmother, that we embed all these relational experiences early in our life, and the quality of those connections stay with us inside our inner sense of self. And so when we partner with different people in different times in our life, we bring these relational nervous system experiences and felt experiences and patterns that live inside of us. We bring them to our adult relationships, and often they can be awakening and challenging and hard until we become more conscious of what's going on. I think that was kind of answering at least your first question.
Yeah, absolutely did. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like that was incredibly helpful in getting that 30,000 foot view. I know we're in broad brushstrokes and there's a particular complexity at play when we're embedding different styles within each of us in different spaces of our lives. That was one of the questions I had for you was in work, in social, in family, in parenting, in partnership, intimacy. Like, where are all of how do all these live together? And I love it because I love your answer, because it really, pulled back the veil on the tendency to collapse identity into an attachment style, which I see so common. An anxious type, and it's like, how about when I'm in my anxious nervous
Right.
system, these are the patterns of behavior I present with, and starting to just become a little bit more nuanced and wear it lightly and not collapse identity into the story, because especially when we're invested in shifting it, that's a subtle way to reinforce what's not, the deepest truth of our nature. And so I think I really
Absolutely.
appreciate that.
I
Yeah.
mean, I wrote the book Anxiously Attached, so I get that. But, I think the labels have a place because they give us a sense of I'm not crazy and this is how it
Mm.
started. And then, and then you have to remember that you have your own unique experience and that you're so much more than just one label, even if you can identify with it. So, to keep that open and understand that is a challenge. I'm just happy that people are kind of starting to understand attachment theory because
Yeah.
and identifying in the first place, and now I'm asking people not to over identify. Yeah.
It's funny. There's that pendulum again.
Yeah.
And well, I think why it's vital in relational connection is it extends a deeper sense of recognition when we can go, I too know that feeling, versus what's wrong with you, or what that you're this way. And then we, it's like, however we're holding relationship with ourselves, we're projecting that out inevitably. And so if I'm collapsing identity somewhere, I'm probably doing that, outwardly as well. So if I'm able to hold the complexity and diversity of my own nervous system with compassion and understanding, I'm more likely, I think, to be able to see when something's coming up. Like, I made that a very intentional practice for myself when I feel myself move to judgment, to recognize it as like a flare coming up and saying, hold on a second, do I know this experience too? And I try to actually put the words I too know, and then what I'm seeing, and it softens the rigidity, whether that's hypo, like, it just lets me kind of see what's happening with fresh eyes and more neutrality, and that makes more space for grace in my experience. And that can be so helpful for, one another, when, because we're all going to have these moments. It's nice when we are with another human being that can, not just be super reactive to our reactivity, and be not just a mirror, but like a kind mirror that says, like, I'm going to see the person behind the behavior. And, that's a gift.
Yeah, I like to change the word trigger to awakened
Mhm.
because every sensation that we have in our body has a story, and what we know about memory and how we know that the body is keeping the score literally. And if we have sensation going off and we feel awful, or our behaviors are kind of what we feel extreme, what we're really saying, I don't like the word trigger, we're saying like there's something in me that got awakened. And when I can shift the language around it, you can start to get curious and almost tend to the inner experience differently. And hopefully the people around us can start to attend. And I think when you do this work, I'm sure you're familiar with it, like compassion grows on both sides because you're like, oh my God, I can start to tend to my inner world differently. What got awakened in me? And then you realize that like we're all just doing the best we can, kind of getting touched all the time, and lend that curiosity and that compassion to other people when we're not in our own in our own stuff so much. So I love changing that language. I think changing the language that we speak to ourselves is so important, and it actually fits. I mean, we're not triggered, we're really awakening old parts all the time to bring into conscious awareness. And when we think of it that way, as horrible or as painful, as hard as some of these experiences are, when they're awakening and we can bring them into our conscious awareness and bring them to people, we can heal them, and then they move out of the body. And there's like kind of an empowering way to kind of reframe what we might be experiencing.
I'm so appreciative. That's going to be a takeaway of this episode for me on a personal level. It's similar to the selfish, selfless, selfful thing. I find myself also attuning to words a lot and realizing that the way that we speak is a reflection of the way that we think. And there's an embedded pattern there that when we say the word trigger, as much as I can hear myself saying, like learning to befriend the trigger, see the trigger as an ally, that even just calling it trigger really holds a negative connotation to it, as if it's like you're calling it an adversary and then needing to counteract it by framing it as an ally, when you can just go underneath that and say what got awakened. It's neutral, tending towards invitation of curiosity and compassion, which it's funny that you tuned in on those two words, because I call those the two C's. And that it's like, if I could bring anything to what's arising, it's those two qualities. And it's really finding them in, like, I call it like heart mind. It's like it's really investigating it through those lenses. And I really am grateful for that reframe. Thank you for that. I'm going to bring it into my own self and my work, and that's a great contribution to this episode. Um, so when we are present to what is being awakened, and we can bring our curiosity, our compassion, our empathetic and empathic attunement, our emotional attunement, as you said, to ourselves and to each other, we have a adaptive, resilient capacity innate within us to retrain our nervous systems to find safer and secure connection with one another that is the biological imperative that you spoke of. Is that a way of framing it all that works for you?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I would add that there is a very important word. It's called co-regulation.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we store awakened parts and they are young and they weren't met originally when we had them, the wound, with a nervous system that could hold them and help. Remember, we don't have a parasympathetic, so our primary is a stand-in. And if they didn't access their parasympathetic very much, we can't calm these awakened parts down. So we have to bring them and have someone lend their system to help us re-experience these parts. And so the biological need or the magic is in the co-regulation that we might get from another human. And so I'm a big believer that yes, connection is a biological imperative, and really good connection and co-regulation leads to self-regulation, not the other way around. So the
Mm-hmm.
more we can bring these parts to people who can help hold them, the more we internalize those people and they become secure anchors for us inside. We take them in. And
Mm-hmm.
so all of that is beautiful, and that co-regulation is kind of where it's at.
Mm-hmm. I was describing, we were in the context of a yoga teacher training, and I was describing it to the trainees as yoga is sort of like a collective co-regulation drive-through experience. Like, you think about what's happening and people like moving through their day, and then they drive up to this building, park their car, get out, walk in to this room, and you move through a series of regulation practices, nervous system regulation practices that are somatic, pranic, emotional. I want to call it reflective listening, really deep witness consciousness. And there's other beings in the room and the teacher and the music, all these different elements that support this sort of like, oof, I'm co-regulated, I'm going back out. And what a neat thing that is for our culture, that has, like you said, it's really shifted away from that. And so to embed these little service stations where we can drive through, co-regulate, and continue, and build those connections, those relationships, that sense of community from that ground. It's the synergistic amplification of that is really profound to see when I'm able to drop in through this experience, as you described it. It's through the co-regulation that we access the self-regulation, and then I'm picturing like the recycle loop, and then it like goes back out and gains momentum. That's a template of what community can look like. And how do we bring that into other places?
Right. And if you think of it as on an attachment lens, anyone with an insecure type, like I mentioned, they internalized a parent that was probably anxious or not fully available, who couldn't calm them because that parent wasn't calm enough within their own system, right? So when we become an adult, we have to find people who have that quality, so that we internalize our parents for better or worse. We internalize we internalize everyone, to be honest, the good and the bad. And then, based on what happens with co-regulation is that if we get enough attunement and co-regulation, we internalize that parent inside. But if we don't get that, we're out in the universe and we don't have a sense of safety. We don't have a sense of someone is with me enough to feel calm enough to get our systems to kind of calm down. So we need to latch on or find people. Latch on is not the right word, but really that's how you feel. Like we need to find people who can offer us that type of presence and consistency and warmth and non-judgmental, and be there for us. And then our system learns, I'm going to internalize that person. They're going to be a new person inside of me. And that's what the baby didn't get, right? And that's not our mom's fault. The baby just didn't get a felt sense of this person is safe, this person is there for me, this person is calm. Your mom might have been doing the best she could, but if she can't give that, she can't give that. So we need to re-experience that in our adult life with people who have the capacity to really show up in that way. And as our culture, it's scary because a lot of people are moving away from that capacity, and we're finding less and less of that type of connection being fostered. If I have to be a little bit on the negative side there, it's a little alarming.
Yeah. So first off, I felt just such a massive wave of emotion move through me just now, that didn't feel dysregulating so much as powerful. The sense of human kindness when we do encounter people that are willing and able, they have the willingness, the wantingness, and the capacity to do that with us, for each other. It's such a rare, it's so fucking beautiful. Like it's really it's like gold of life. Like that is it. And it's not just like intimate relationships. It's like, and I get to do that with my kids. Like I get to do that with my partner. I get to do that in community. Like when we can do that for each other, like really genuinely open our hearts and see each other and hold each other in whatever space we're in, and offer that co-regulation when it's available. It's like that should be like, we should get rid of these old outdated notions of chivalry, and like that's chivalry. Like that's something that's like really, really meaningful and beautiful. So yeah, I just had to share that, like the wave of like, as I was, maybe it was my mirror neurons were just firing as I was imagining somebody offering that warmth in a space where I've been in like a freezing, like, I was going to say desert, but they're not freezing. So whatever that is. And just being able to thaw our nervous systems together. It's just so beautiful. And I would love to get into this idea for a moment. I know it's like slightly tangential. I had it in here towards the end of the pod, I had referenced that I had a few left field questions, but you've referenced a couple of times culture. And so I'm a fan of, it's a little cerebral, but I'm a fan of Ken Wilber's integral theory work. And it
I have
essentially,
this book.
oh, cool. Yeah. Yeah. Really good. Essentially purports this idea, amongst other things, of four quadrant theory, which essentially looks at like the world through the lens of the internal and external aspects of self and collective. So the quadrants, if you could imagine, like, like a cross with four corners, and each box there would be like upper left would be like interior of the individual, and then upper right would be the exterior of the individual. Bottom left would be the interior of the collective, and bottom right would be the exterior of the collective. The map is just a map, it's just a way of conceptualizing, and there's more layering to it. But the idea that when we drive attachment theory from an individual to this intra to interpersonal, but then it's obviously what you're talking about is interpersonal. So once we start to extrapolate these um, embedded nervous system experiences that we're sharing to a collective level, whether that's family, community, country, world, what do you see is happening? I don't know if this feels too macro, but I get really into politics and geopolitics and what's happening, and so even just domestically, let's say, within the United States specifically, what do you see as the trends that are occurring neurobiologically through the lens of attachment theory?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a really great question, and unfortunately, it's a really kind of sad answer. But well, first I'll start to say that I said I come from the line of like more like Ian McGillicris, and how our brain has kind of changed um, from like the Industrial Revolution, kind of being the first big change of we're going to divide land. This is yours, this is mine, and us becoming more focused on me rather than we. And that actually is really directly linked to our brain. So our a sense of we-ness lives more in our right hemisphere, and our sense of me-ness, well, individuality, lives a little bit more in the left. And so capitalism, surviving, acquiring things, looking at things as transactional. What's the exchange? We lose the sense of like, for example, like we use both of our hemispheres to, move around, but we're moving more towards the left. But if we look at a tree, the right hemisphere would feel maybe oneness with the tree and see this unique tree in front of us and have this experience in relational experience to this tree. The left hemisphere more look at the tree and like, how can I cut it down? Or this is an oak tree, and we would be labeling it and we'd figure out a way to use it. So we're, as a culture, moving more towards the left, which is great for survival and productivity, but horrible for relational connection and a sense of wholeness and kind of like the things that give meaning to life. So that's the way I see us moving. And then if you couple that with internet and the transactional nature and our attention spans and the screen time that we're doing and the lack of human to human connection that are, unfortunately, the generations below us are really going to suffer from, we're moving away from secure attachment, and we're moving more into like more isolated, more anxiety, more aloneness. Like our kids are going to have all of these anxieties because they're not getting enough connection. They're literally foregoing connection to go online, and online is structured in a way that gets your brain to like, you can't hold attention spans, all of these horrible things. So we're moving away from secure attachment, and we're moving more into insecure attachment based on our culture and based on what we prioritize and we glamorize, and we are taught to be successful and thin and pretty, and this and that, and competitive, and so we're raised in a culture that really doesn't support what we inherently need, and it's very, very confusing for people to, like, yeah, and many clients I've gotten to this place where I look perfect, or I've achieved this, and I'm miserable, and I'm alone, and I'm depressed. And it's like, because those aren't the things that give us meaning. Connection is our biological imperative, and if we lived really far in the left hemisphere, we're isolated and we're pretty alone. So it's very problematic, and the climate of our current culture, or political culture, I would say, is a problem. And I won't get too
Yeah.
much into it, but there are some archetypes out there that represent me and capitalism, and some that represent we. And we're moving sadly away from the sense of we-ness, and more to a sense of me-ness, and experiencing a political divide. And yeah, I could talk a lot on that, but I don't know if you want me to, but
I do.
just
I love it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I don't, I try, for me, recently, I'm like, I don't want to engage in pendulum energy. So
Sure.
I don't want to engage too much in negative energy, let's say around Trump, right? But I do feel like he's an archetype that brought up to the surface a lot of things within me to look at, right? And
Mm,
that, someone was going to bring the subconscious and the issues that I think are issues to the surface, and he's very much doing that. And so it's hard when you see people resonating with what what other people, it's hard because people are so seeing things through their own individual lens. And I feel
mm,
like for the first time in history, it's not the first time in history, but like, we are so opposing in how we are seeing reality. And that part is kind of what's
mm,
scary for me, is that one person is seeing reality very different from the other. The story I make up in my head is that, like, people who have suppressed anger, or certain ideologies that have been suppressed, they're now kind of given an outlet for them. And so I just try to be conscious with it all, and try to understand that people have different lenses. And I think if you come from more of a we-ness, you're not going to kind of support the extreme capitalism, view. But that could just be a judgment, that I'm making. But yeah, I struggle politically. 4 years ago, I struggled a lot. I'm really trying to approach this political campaign without getting too much into the energy of it, because I think the more we feed it, the
mhm.
more it wants. So I try to, like, not engage too much, like, just be enough informed, but not, I kind of send energy to that builds momentum in places that I want the momentum to be completely gone, if that makes sense.
Mm. It really does. And a couple of maybe three or so takeaways from what you shared. One is I could feel my sympathetic nervous system response. I felt the shift into, yeah, maybe more of this dorsal kind of space, and just through the topic, like just through the topic alone. And I could feel my heart rate increase, and I could feel, like, in my abdomen, a swirling, and even these little pangs of, like, nerve impulses. So just being really present to bodily sensation as the topic changes was fascinating to observe. So I just wanted to name that and bring it out, because we're here having this beautiful conversation about the human condition and how we got to be the way that we are, and how we really need each other.
Mhm.
And the whole point of, like, that's what politics actually is. It's about how we govern our collective, how we work together to create a harmonious society. That is the goal and function of politics. And in creating this podcast, I called it Healing the Divide because of this very thing. And I started to see that my world personally is really full with a lot of people that have so many beautiful skill sets, powerful skill sets in the healing world, air quotes. And not to stereotype, but it's so segregated from the energy that I often see in politics. And I have a deep interest in politics because of its potential to be the way that we govern our world, but it's missing all of the tools. And so if you go back and check out past episodes, there's ones on the election, bringing in Trump supporters and RFK supporters and Biden supporters and having roundtables and all these different things. We can get into Israel Palestine. We look at different societal structures, and that's really important to me because it's really, we talk about like applied polyvagal theory and applied attachment theory, but why don't we have like applied polyvagal theory in politics? Why don't we have applied attachment theory in politics? What does a trauma-informed politics look like? Why do we just all write that off? And so I started to think, you know what I want to do? I started buying up books on think tanks and going, I want to create a think tank of healers that get together to take on the world's or our country's biggest problems through the lens of the skill sets that we each carry, talk together, and then create a lobby out of that, or something out of that can actually inform a deeper consciousness in the places where it's needed the most, but also missing the most, right? Where it's most relevant but most absent. And if it is true that what you said, that we have that co-regulation informs self-regulation, then why is it in the most influential aspect of our human experience we are so deeply divided? It is profound, and to me that's why I said I do want you to talk about it. There's nothing I would rather you talk about, quite honestly, than this. I'm sure you've done a billion podcasts on attachment theory, but to drive it into the context that it's excluded from is what excites me. And so I want to just get a little bit more granular to maybe thread this piece through a little bit more. What I've seen in my own subjective bias is I think you're onto something with the sort of the archetypal Trump supporter. I'm going to speak in broad brushstrokes: the repressed anger, the repressed isolation, etc., the me mentality. It feels like it does all of a sudden. Now I have an advocate. Now I have a mouthpiece, and that can come out. But what I'll say in response to that is that it feels like the we has been co-opted and manipulated by the Democratic Party to be a false representation of the authentic expression of what we looks like, because it's easy enough to look at Trump and say, that's the bad thing. Come over here. We're the other thing. It's like, do you want, the bigot on the right or the puppet on the left? A system bereft of truth, and it's like a false juxtaposition, or, of red and blue. And it's like that, we are not that, what's the word, like, binary in terms of being humans, that this need for individuality that can get co-opted by the conservative movement can be like individuality at the expense of the collective. And sometimes it feels like, especially more the progressive wing of the Democratic Party says, like, it's all the collective at the expense of the individual. And until we're able to see the way you so eloquently described it at the onset of the podcast, was that they're to be selfful. There's an individual and a collective. They're not at odds with each other. It's what balance looks like. And so when I start to look at the way things, like whether that's through establishment media, I don't even like using mainstream media to go into our word choices. But I do believe it's a mouthpiece of a political establishment that transcends even these bifurcations and expresses through both of them. Because when you really look at, following the money of all of this, it really does go back to three institutions called Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock that uphold all of it. And then it's like, oh, I feel like I have sovereignty between choosing this or choosing that, but both of them are not choosing this aligned self in conscious relationship to the whole experience. And so now I think it's an interesting time politically for us. Again, all this in my own subjective lens, but what does the authentic expression look like in what we're speaking to? I do see a potential in RFK as a candidate that represents something different than those choices. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, again, to the degree that you feel comfortable talking about this.
Right. I think there was a meme going around like if the next presidency was a relationship, I think United States needs to take some time off and regroup. Because we've been so polarized. And I think for me personally, when I was experiencing a lot 4 years ago, one of the reality like crushers for me was I realized how much the story was twisted on both sides, and
Mhm.
how impressionable we are, and how we all can be rallied and be like totally not have a sense of reality, and how fragile our sense of reality is based on what is being projected to us and what we want to trust. And I think for me personally, I've lost trust in both parties, um more or less as to where they are in history right now,
Mhm.
and the pendulum of them is kind of making them undesirable, and there's no middle path. Um, and so the spiritual person in me believes that there has to be chaos before there is order, and that we're in a period of kind of chaotic upheaval. And the hope in me is that we reassemble to a new sense of order that needed to happen. And in order to get to a new sense of order, we must have a sense of chaos. So I think things sometimes need to get bad before change occurs. And I think, and I hope that positive change comes from this. And I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I think we're on a trajectory of we might need to learn some things the hard way. We are absolutely killing our beautiful planet. We are making choices that are honestly devastating, to really understand what people are suffering and how they're suffering right now in this moment. As we sit here, there are people having, in the Middle East, and I won't get into it, but it's like to have a sense of awareness around where we truly at is actually frightening. It's very frightening. And I think for me personally, I've just gone through this period where I not second guess everything, but I start to look at the structures in place and I start to challenge them a little bit in my mind. And I think so much of what we're going through is so unnecessary,
Mhm.
and yet maybe necessary to wake systems up and to create change. And that's the only way I kind of can wrap my head around some pretty alarming situations that we are currently in. And I won't talk too much about them because I don't think diving into the fear of them helps. I just think that sometimes situations have to get bad before there's change. And I think the United States needs a lot of change. And I'm not sure it's going to happen overnight. But I think if it gets worse, it's just trying to wake us up, essentially.
So to superimpose the attachment theory paradigm onto the geopolitical paradigm, it would look something like it's not a trigger, something's being awakened. So if we could understand it that way, we would see that right now we're going through a collective awakening of what has been repressed inside of us. It's not just a trigger, it is an awakening. And
Oh, that's
uh,
a great way to put it. Yeah.
yeah. And so that's the curiosity I have, is when we put these frameworks onto those places, then we go, oh, okay, all of this stuff needed to come up to be seen. The What we're projecting is a reflection of the division that lives within each of us. It's coming out. It might happen over, who knows, decades, centuries, who knows what we're in. It's just an evolutionary blink of an eye, but we're experiencing it in the real time of our lives. And to me, that brings us back to the power of the personal practice for each of us to take good care of ourselves, to each do our part in healing our own wounds, so that what we, the way we call in relationships to support that, as you're sharing, will eventually trickle out. But there does seem to be this other piece, which is, again, what motivates me to include this type of content on this podcast, is there is a certain implicit courage for someone like you to even open up to this kind of conversation. And same, because it's like, here we are in these seats of neutrality trying to support humans' inner work. And it's such charged material. There's almost like another little voice that comes up and like, don't go there, man. Don't talk about this, because you're going to ostracize the person who's identified in one of those polarized extremes, and that's going to negatively influence your left side that's transactional.
Uh-huh.
And it's like, but fuck it, like I can't be complicit in my own canceling, in my own censorship. That
Uh-huh.
doesn't mean I need to be identified with a particular myopic perspective. I fight for your right to disagree with me. I
Uh-huh.
don't want to live in a world of homogenous perspectives. I want there to be diversity and skillful exchange of ideas. And so my idea with this podcast is it's a platform to take the places where we have tools and understanding for healing and human connection, apply them into the contexts where they're missing, and to summon up the courage, not necessarily the absence of the fear, but the courage to have the conversation anyway. And then maybe it's a little messy. Maybe there's some rupture. Maybe there's repair, because we are endowed with those skills. We've been developing them. So let's, as these people, let's start to have these conversations. And then that way that feels contributive to this paradigm shifting rather than isolating and silencing.
Absolutely. And yeah, it is hard to speak up around these. It's a scary climate, but yet we need to have authentic sharing in these spaces. And hopefully, I think for me, there's a lot more openness now than there was 4 years ago. I was very charged at one point. And if you think of as the president, as a primary caregiver, it's like, what are you identifying in them that gives you a sense of peace? And if it's me, capitalism, racism, all that, you're going to identify in one way. And if it's we, and I don't even think, honestly, I think I think both extremes are so out of touch with what we truly need. They've gotten so lost in the fight of it that, like, I'm not sure I identify at all anymore. And maybe that's what needs to happen for me, is a reassembly of, like, what is my truth. And I can't just follow a party because I think they represent me, because now I feel like, I don't know, I just feel it's just too extreme. It's all about, the other, rather than what it needs to really be about. So I'm not I don't normally talk about politics, and I can tell you I'm not educated enough to talk about politics. But I think we're just at a very interesting time, and my hope is that we come out of this more with a sense of we, and I don't really care how we get there, but that's what we need, is a sense of we for each other.
Yeah, thank you so much for your willingness to engage in this material as well.
Mhm.
I do believe it is incumbent upon people that are actively engaged in the evolution of their own consciousness to become participatory at whatever level they happen to be operating in terms of their awareness of these issues, to start to speak. Because you're, like you were saying earlier about your the co-regulation need is so often just presence, like emotionally attuned presence. It's not about the information. It is about having emotionally attuned nervous systems, being able to engage one another across differences of view, to be able to dialogue consciously across our differences in a way that says, oh, right, of course, we're never all going to line up and think the same thing. Isn't that beautiful? So I appreciate your participation in
Yeah.
this.
And I would say that The problem is, instead of co-regulating with the audience, the way in which political parties are revving up the audience is through sympathetic activation and fear. Yeah, so the fear is driving the momentum, and fear is what separates us. So fear lives in the left hemisphere. Like, fear is literally what is separating us. So if we're using fear to promote a political party, there's never going to be a sense of we. And that is certainly, and that's done on both sides. And that sense of fear is separating us.
I am enjoying this so much that I love putting this frame on top of politics and seeing it clarify itself, our understanding. It helps us organize our own participation and relationship to this part of our shared human endeavor.
And I would say, like, from a interpersonal neurobiology lens, I'm pretty sure of this. Like, we're wired to be in community, right? We are wired to have a sense of belonging and be in community. Our brains are not really wired to go onto TV and see what's happening all over the world. That is actually giving us more sympathetic activation. Like, and not that we shouldn't watch what's happening all over. We should definitely be informed, but we're wired to know what's happening in our community. We haven't evolved quite yet. So if we're watching the news, and that's why I'm so careful now. If I'm watching what's happening, I have to know what's going on in the Middle East. And yet I don't want to watch too much of it, because that fear or that can penetrate, it can be too much. And my system's not made to be watching the news chronically and taking in all that stimulation all over the place. So it's like this delicate balance of, like, how can I take in information from what sources, and at what point is it just fear, or is it just, and knowing where my limit is has been really important for me, in terms of, like, creating a sense of safety in my immediate world, and also being somewhat in touch with what's happening on a big scale. And when you're in the right hemisphere, you feel suffering, you feel your own suffering, and you feel collective suffering. So it's a lot. You're taking in a lot all the time, if you're really in touch with all of that. So that's, like, the only thing I would add, yeah, too, that it's a little bit dangerous to over watch that stuff. So
Yeah, I won't even. That's not how I receive information, is by turning on the TV. That's like, do you want the poison in this
right.
cereal box or the poison from that cereal box, and then calling it balanced because you eat one on Monday and one on Tuesday. I mean, it's like it feels like a prehistoric version of balance to me. Like, to me, it would be like, find the sources, the independent sources of journalism. Don't be so lazy to think you're going to get the truth by pressing a button on a switch in your coffee table. Like, the points at the box on the wall. Like, we have to be a little bit more proactive in filtering through that noise, I think, because it's really propaganda, and go, okay, where are these trustworthy sources? Who are they? And then how can we move into our own? It's interesting, reclaiming of authority. When you were talking about, like, if the president is the primary caregiver in the model, I think that's fascinating that we would even co-sign on that. Like, I remember being a kid, and it's like mom, dad, God, president, teacher, coach, like, sports coach. Like, they're like these, like, internalized authority figures up here. And now, like, the more that we do our work, it's like, the president is not my primary caregiver. That he's just a guy with more probably stuff going on, probably some fearful wiring, some disorganized wiring in there, around that can start to, I mean, amongst many other styles, I'm sure, but it's like, why do I abdicate my authority to another human because of a role that they have? And there's something empowering about reclaiming that I am the authority of my own being. And it's, yeah, it's radically freeing. And it's been how I've been raising my children to really see that they're not just, because if you believe this way, you could be born into a different culture and just think what that culture thinks. Or you could be born at a different time and you would just think what that, you know, even if it's religion, like you just believe in the religion that somebody handed to you. Like, why aren't we questioning everything, reassembling, to use your terminology, everything we've inherited so much? And yet, are we taught to genuinely question it and then realign with what we feel and know to be true through the body too, right? Like with the work that you do, it's not just like I prescribe to this belief system, but I'm like watching what's happening in my body in real time and utilizing it as a barometer, a compass, and maybe a lantern even to light my path. To go back on track to the interpersonal for a moment after that wonderful political tangent. Um, what happens when we look at the different pairings? So let's, for the sake of this thought experiment, imagine that we are talking about two people in intimate relationship, and they both primarily carry ancient anxious attachment styles in intimate relationship. What are the challenges that they would bump into?
Oh God. They might not be open for connection too much outside of the relationship. So they might like huddle or not be as available for other relationships.
Mm.
One person might be more anxious than another, which turns
Mm.
into the anxious avoidant dance. Right.
Mm.
Uh-huh. And depending on the fear, and I would say this with all insecure attachment, the fear blocks you from really feeling free and unique and in an individual. And so a loss of sense of self can happen in dynamics that two insecure styles pair up and they don't do any inner work. So they sacrifice parts to make the other person feel safe and the illusion of
Mm.
safety.
In the context of some sort of rupture, is there the potential that they both turn away from each other and there's just like communication breakdown
With two anxious,
to avoid that? Sorry.
to avoidant,
Oh, I'm sorry. I did ask you anxious. No wonder that wasn't making sense. Sorry.
okay.
Stay with it.
Um,
Anxious. Yeah.
two anxious partners.
They're not going to have
This is
another.
generalizing, but anxious people tend to struggle with conflict and want to run towards and fix right away. They also can have like a hairline triggered anger. So I would imagine that more like explosive type of ruptures happening rather than and trying to figure it out in an activated state between two people would be happening more often if we're looking at it that way. Again, one person could shut down and anxious people don't always respond in that way, but they tend to run towards in fear rather than run away to try to fix.
Yeah, my mind went to double avoidance. So I apologize for the context shift. So the anxious combo could sort of escalate as they're both looking to like bring that charge towards resolution. So what would be helpful for them if you could give them the 30-second sort of self regulation when
Yeah, I mean, I write about
total
this like
available.
I mean, most people are listening, just starting to understand your nervous system responses and when you're activated, coming up with ways to kind of be with that part or take that part to someone who can help hold you or to understand the pain that's underneath the fear. So if you're one of those that get really angry and really feisty, you're just terrified, right? And so it's like, how can we get underneath that emotional response and understand what is the real terror? What's the root of the terror? Have you felt this terror before? How old were you when you originally found it? Let's make this about something that's so much more about what is living inside you versus what's happening in the here and now, because usually the terror is very young.
Mm.
So just like questions like that might help someone with more of an anxious attachment who kind of struggles, and can you kind of step back and not pour more gasoline on the fire, is what I say, and start to work with your nervous system to get into a sense of we
Mm.
again, and back to a place where you can get back into connection.
I'd imagine there's some element of it's great that both people are looking for connection in that combination, but it's also the tendency, as you shared, to self-sacrifice, that there could be this like agreement to mutually self-sacrifice.
Yeah, and I'd say like so the running towards and the fear is not really connection,
Right.
because it's a sense of terror, trying to medicate the terror a little by
Mhm.
running towards. So when you're running towards your partner because you're scared and you might abandon them, I wouldn't call that like connection. I would say that's more like fear and looking to calm the fear down. And if your partner can't calm it down, you might escalate more. And so that's where the earlier wounding is. So, yeah, I guess they think they're looking for connection, but they're really looking to not feel abandoned, right? Or not
Mhm.
feel like alone, or so the fear is driving that behavior. In all of the behavior, usually it's fear that's driving the behavior. Even with an avoidant person who's shutting down, I mean, they're not trying to shut down on you. Like, that's how their nervous system responds in fear. It's just like, oh, that can be said, oh, an avoidant person doesn't want to connect, they just shut down and leave. Well, an anxious person really isn't connecting either, they're just scared, running towards. So both are born of fear, and I think avoidance gets such a bad rep. But it's all fear, it's all nervous system fear, and my nervous system is connected to your nervous system. And if you're my partner, especially, and mine goes into fear, it might signal telepathically to send yours into fear. And it doesn't really matter what our attachment systems are. If our nervous system's saying danger, I could say, hey, Scott, I'm scared right now, but my nervous system's in danger. Your nervous system is picking up that telepathically and going into a threat response as well. So it's complicated, and kind of hard to understand how every dynamic might play out.
Yeah, I can see the complexity of that, shifting trigger to awakening, the simultaneous awakening, because then the co-regulation may not be available for
Well,
you for your partner.
and that's the problem. The wounds are so early and so dysregulating, and you can't get back into connection with your partner. It's awakening, but without another person to help you understand what you're going through, and without a deeper understanding, it's called misery, right? We're just
Mhm.
repeating patterns and feeling a lot of pain and not really able to connect the dots. And that nothing gets resolved. It just gets repeated.
Yeah, the game changer of a sentence for me in my own, relationship healing has been, how can we do it differently?
Yeah.
And just asking that question and getting just enough, even if it's like a tiny iota of wherewithal, to say, the feelings in my body are enough to tell me this isn't the space I want to choose from, speak from, act from. I'm going to call in help from somewhere else where it is
Yeah.
available to co-regulate elsewhere, and not choose not to speak from those places. And then to recognize, I think, to like that, to signal to our partner. So my version is avoidant high, avoidant anxious. So what I see happen would be, with honoring the privacy of our relationship, but speaking sort of like pattern level, would be, the as an avoidant, I withdraw to meet my need, which can then signal the abandonment that activates more anxious, that
Hmm.
then pushes on more avoid.
Hmm.
So it's in that dance. So I'm so proud of us because we've learned how to, first off, recognize what's happening, cultivate a language to speak to what's happening, and sometimes just insert the proper verbiage. I say proper, that sounds very like whatever, but the skillful, or at least helpful verbiage for us, which is, I feel like withdrawing, but I'm not. I'm just going to
Mhm.
co-regulate elsewhere, and I am coming back. And for my partner to lead with, you didn't do anything wrong, I'm not going anywhere. Um, and I recognize that this is like a younger part of me that's coming up. And I'm
Mhm.
going to try to find a place, if you're not available to co-regulate with me, to help me find that so we can come back in genuine connection. And when we're able
Mhm.
to do that, it's like, whoa, like absolutely inspiring. And there's healing that happens there because we learn from that. That's like, oh, you can have that rupture and repair. And when I think the more we learn that, it it helps us to default to that model a little bit more so each time,
Mhm.
until that starts to take up more bandwidth in the nervous system.
Absolutely. I think you're rewiring and relearning, and that sounds amazing because you have the felt experience of I'm my pattern is this and her pattern is that, but we're able to communicate with we language and instead of me and defensive and you're doing this to me. It's just more like this is what's coming up inside of me and to communicate around that
Yeah.
effectively. That's a game changer. I mean, I wrote a whole chapter on that and like learning about your nervous system and communicating around your nervous system and helping your partner understand that they're not actually trying to abandon you or hurt you, that things are being awakened on both sides. I think you know, if couples could get that, it's just like light bulb moments. Not that the work isn't there, the work continues, but like now you can actually have a framework in terms of saying, okay, like there's so much more going on here and we have different ways of communicating about it that get us back into connection. And that's really, that's what the fear is loss of connection.
What do you think? Well, first off, let me say yes, that we would have these ahas where, like, every time there is some sort of conflict, like literally every time, Jessica, we would get down to the root. Like, it's like we're on the other side of it. We've co-regulated. We're back in this, like, beautiful connection. And we go, like, isn't it funny? We like chuckle that every time it's always the desire for connection at the bottom of it. Oh, I was just wanting connection. Oh, I was just wanting connection. So now it's
Yeah.
just like, go fast forward right to that point. What's happening underneath it? There is just a need for connection that felt threatened.
Mm-hmm. And it's the threat or the illusion of threat, because
Mhm.
sometimes through neuroception, we're not even really being threatened at that time, but our nervous system is remembering something that can set our system off to feel threatened in the moment. And so it's the threat of lost connection, or some people, like someone who's really avoidant might say, I I don't really can't really accept love. Like there are things that we sabotage because the connection can also terrify us. So it's
Mm.
interesting on so many levels, and everybody's in a different place. But usually, it's a projection of I'm going to lose this connection. This person's going to leave me. This person's going to abandon me. That causes all the behaviors. And really, when I'm doing couples counseling, and I do a lot of couples counseling, it comes down to like connection, quality of connection, bid for connection. How do we come back into connection safely when we both have been awakened? And, sometimes two awakened nervous systems that are dysregulated can't come back into connection so easily. Sometimes we need another person to help us kind of get back into connection. It's really great that you and your partner are able to kind of work through rupture and repair, because that's how you deepen intimacy. I mean, that's literally, the foundation of a deeper, romantic, more intimate relationship. And I think that's just so wonderful that you have that.
Thank you so much. That is the takeaway after that recognition, is we feel closer because of it. We
Hmm.
got to heal a piece of something old inside of us, an old wound in each of us that got activated in some way. And that's really beautiful. I'm chuckling at the reversal of all these different, like, words and different spaces today. Like, in like yogic philosophy, attachment has a negative connotation, but in this psychology, like, attachment is like this good positive thing. And then, like, awakening has this, like, positive connotation, but here we're using it, it's like, we are using it as a positive connotation, actually,
Yeah.
but culturally it's traditionally thought of as like that trigger.
But
And then
when
even
has an awakening ever been a easy experience? Not in my life. I'm like, oh wow, I'm awakening and I'm evolving consciousness. That just means I just went through a portal of suffering and I now have a new perspective on life. But I hear you and I understand what you're
yeah,
saying. Yeah. And
yeah,
I really struggle like in my 20s or like 20s. I studied, I got very much into yoga and attachment is a bad thing. And I remember talking to my mentor and it really harmed me. And so how the East thinks about attachment is absolutely wonderful. But how the West interprets it, like takes that in, was I shouldn't be attached to anyone. And for someone who struggles with more of an anxious pattern, that caused me to be super independent and I really swung the pendulum. And so I just think that we have to be so careful in which the context that we take these, because we absolutely need healthy attachment in our life. When we literally can't survive without, and healthy attachment lets us feel free and detached. Like, because it's healthy attachment, we have autonomy and we have uniqueness and we have a sense of belonging. So the attachment doesn't, it, it's so a play on words. Everything's such a paradox. And I fell into that trap of like, I don't need attachment. And really that's a protector, and it's a message that we don't want to send out there. You absolutely need attachment. It's healthy attachment that actually leads to liberation.
it's the word usage that gets us kind of hooked and funky in it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it really is recognizing a similar thing once we can get our words lined up. Can you expand upon the idea of the inner protectors?
Sure. So we're not even aware of our protectors, but we need them, right? And an inner protector could be your critical voice, it could be alcoholism, it could be shopping, it could be fantasy, creating fantasy. Like, none of these things are bad. Like, we have to eat, we have to buy things. Fantasy helps us, but like when we are struggling with reality, and when we don't have a safe place to feel our emotion, when we haven't learned how to move through emotion, when we don't have a safe environment, even staying in sympathetic activation, like the busyness and chaotic and productivity, is actually a protector. So we're constantly and thankfully protecting ourselves from what we can't hold until we have safe enough places and people to hopefully use less protectors and hopefully have the ability to feel and move through more. So our protectors are needed and they're there for good reason, and we want to welcome all of them. And with more healing, the need for them usually lessens and lessens and lessens. And so we don't need them and we become more aware of, okay, what was this actually protecting me from? Oh, this feeling, I needed that protector at that time. So I study IFS too. I believe that all our parts are needed and protectors are definitely needed if something's really going on that's really, really scary inside. We will come up with wonderful ways to avoid it because we don't have the felt experience that it's okay to feel it and go through it. And then if we do hopefully get into containers or places or around people, you'd be surprised the protectors go down, and the ability to kind of allow whatever we've been kind of avoiding to surface will come through our own inherent wisdom in an organic way. To kind of move through whatever we might be having to have avoided.
Thank you for that. And it's really powerful to see, because it feels like, again, speaking subjectively here for a moment, that when they do get aroused, there's such an identification with them that it's almost like everything else goes offline. And I can start to feel almost like justified. I almost feel like Bruce Banner becomes the Hulk or something. It's like, you do not get to talk to me this way, or that's like some sort of like enacting of a boundary from this protector, because normally I would lead like with maybe more like chill. So then it's going to come out more, fiery or in a bigger way or something. And then inevitably that sort of throws like oil on the flames of rupture. And then when there is some sort of self-regulation available, the repair conversation we utilize imago dialoguing frameworks for, just in my relationship. And that, so we'll literally just input that structure, and it's been so helpful because it's like when there's like nothing else available, there's almost it's not a nervous system, but maybe because it's been utilized so many times, it almost feels like there's co-regulation to the system. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to have my turn. I'll be mirrored.
Mm-hmm.
Agreement is not required for validation.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be able to move through this. She
Mm-hmm.
might not be available for empathy in this moment, but we'll get there. Like there's all these elements that system has provided for us. And I found it really, really powerful. And I'm wondering about, like, I guess what triggered it for me was it's where my protector felt like there was some self-soothing available. Like I can say, well, this is why I have felt that. And I know I'm going to be heard because there's somebody on the other side that is committed to listening with, call it like traveling into the other person's country with only your passport. So it's like we're going to drop all the versions, that we usually have, knowing that like everything that we need will be provided for in this conversation. And that's been really helpful. So I'm wondering about, when you have these various attachment styles, I understand it's hard to kind of go through each one. So I'll put down my, what's the word I'm going to choose instead of attachment, fixation on going through each pairing. But when there is some sort of rupture that occurs across different attachment styles, um, Imago is one thing I found helpful. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that system and other sort of dialoguing interventions that are helpful for couples.
Wow, I'm a certified Imago therapist, so I'm very much a fan of
Yeah.
Imago and the dialogue that Imago provides couples and families. I literally, before this session, I did a virtual hour and a half Imago session with a wonderful couple in Colorado. And I just think the Imago dialogue really gets us out of a sense of me and into a sense of, oh my God, there's someone else and let me get into their world. And um, I just love it. And I love that you're doing it. And I also think emotionally focused couples counseling, although it's not what I'm trained in, I happen to think it's also a great model. And if you're listening and you want to do work with your partner, I would say finding an Imago therapist or an emotionally focused couples counselor is the way to go, because there's so many extra years in training that we have to do in order to kind of hold that type of space. Uh, as far as attachment styles, I would say that when you're with an Imago therapist or when you're with a therapist that really understands protectors, and you can unpack it in that way, then you start to understand, oh my God, this is what was going on in my partner. They were terrified or they felt up against the wall. That's why they had to, leave, or you start to understand why, what was going on inside them, how, where in their childhood did they learn this, what was your partner bringing up from childhood in that moment that maybe activated such and awakened such a deep wound or dance or dynamic. And so when you start to look at these things as like, this is what was going on in my partner, and it's not just what's happening in the here and now, and this is how their nervous system responds to fear. And if you do Imago work, I mean, that's beautiful. You shift the whole relationship dynamic, and it's a level of, I always be careful what you wish for, right? Because I got it, but I was an Imago therapist. I trained years ago, and I just prayed for a conscious relationship, and that's really what we want as Imago, is to keep leveling up our level of consciousness. And so when we start to look at what's coming up in the body as a story or something old, we can level up our level of consciousness. And usually our romantic partners for better or worse, can bring up our attachment wounds. And it's our work to get conscious. Now I would like a soulmate to journey with rather than someone who's going to make me conscious of every painful experience I've been through. But yeah, Imago is it's just a beautiful tool, and it means image in Latin, and
Mm.
I have a lot of success with that model.
Amazing. Thank you. That's a great confirmation. And for listeners to check that out, look into IMAGO, and really, really powerful to bring that into an understanding, a coupleship with attachment theory, IFS, and the understanding of our nervous system, polyvagal theory, as you were
Mhm.
talking about earlier. It's so interesting to coalesce all of this together. Towards the latter part of last year, I created an inner work group to talk about politics called Let's Talk About It, where we looked at like all the charged political issues. But the first session was teaching them imago dialoguing. And then from there, each week we would give them a political issue, say Israel Palestine, and they would go into breakout rooms. It was over Zoom across the country, and they would share their perspectives on these world events and just move through the conversation inside of an Imago framework. And it
Mhm.
was incredible, the shared sense of nervous system safety, being able to just talk about issues with different perspectives. And that's what really inspired me to start this podcast in so many ways. Because I was like, man, if this works there, like we're onto something. Like I want to go to like every college campus now with everything that's happening. And like, just here you go. This is how we can talk about it. And I hope to see that for our world. And I want to be present to time and in service of you being so generous with yours and being here today to wrap up. But I would love to close with just holding space for you to share anything that's on your heart for folks that might be listening, as relevant to either something we've discussed that you want to reinforce, something that we didn't get to that you want to invite in, or just a hope for where we are as people from your perspective as a therapist.
Um, I guess, one of the messages that I am working on now in my next book, but is that healing doesn't happen alone, that we need each other, that we need to find healing relationships. And that if you're suffering and you're listening with the same themes or the same patterns over and over again, to be open to allowing the right relationships to come in and kind of hold space for you, that there is such a pathway out and healing is really possible in the right relationships. I mean, that's kind of what I've learned personally, and that's what I'm writing about professionally. And I think no one needs to do any of this alone. You are not alone. That's an ego state. And that finding community and finding safe people is where it's at.
Mm. Thank you so much. I've often heard myself think or say out loud that because our wounding is relational, our healing is too. And I couldn't agree more. I'm so grateful for you taking the time today to do this and to share this conversation with me and to offer it out into the world. I trust that whoever it is meant for, wherever it will resonate, will find its way to them. And I just want to say deep, deep bow to you for your openness, your transparency, your courage, your clarity in communicating some ideas that are hard to wrap our minds around, especially if they're new to us. So thank you for that contribution and for the really powerful work that you're doing in the world and all the different ways that you're doing it, from you know sessions with individuals to couples to courses to books to podcasts. I know that that's a lot of putting yourself and your own energy out there, and what lives in the unseen behind what's seen. So just for all the places we didn't get to acknowledge, I just want to say I know they're there, and I see what's inherent in your show upness, and a deep bow to all of that. So thank you.
Thank you. That's so touching that you say that, and thank you for having me. You're so well spoken, and you asked so many wonderful questions, and you let me finish, and it was a great conversation, and I'm happy to know you on a more intimate level now because I know about your community and all of that. And so, yeah, thank you for taking the time. And I hope if you're listening, you got, something resonated with you and you got what
Thank you. And we'll see y'all next time on Healing the Divide.